He was all ready to door at least. That's what the telegram would have told his mother back in Manchester. But somewhere in the frozen wasteland between the German and British lines, Private Arthur Pearce was breathing, bleeding, and about to attempt the impossible. On the bitter morning of November the 23rd, 1916, the fields of northern France lay silent after 3 days of relentless artillery bombardment. The Battle of the Somme had supposedly ended weeks earlier, but nobody had informed the guns. In the pre-dawn darkness, beyond the British trenches, near the village of Beaumont-Hamel, a scouting patrol from the 16th Battalion, Manchester Regiment, had walked straight into a German raiding party. The ambush lasted 90 seconds. Of the 12 men who ventured into no man's land that night, 11 were confirmed killed or captured within the first minute. Arthur Pearce was the 12th. He'd fallen into a shell crater when the first shots cracked through the mist, his shoulder striking the frozen mud hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Above him, the night erupted in muzzle flashes and screaming. He pressed his face into the earth, tasting cordite and death. Listening as the voices of men he'd shared tea with just hours before were silenced one by one. Then came the German voices, guttural and efficient, checking bodies, calling out in the dark. Boots crunched past the lip of his crater. A flashlight beam swept overhead. Arthur didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He became stone. The patrol moved on. For 20 minutes, he lay perfectly still in that hole, his heart hammering so violently he was certain it would give him away. When silence finally returned, broken only by the distant rumble of guns to the south, Arthur lifted his head. The British trenches were somewhere behind him, he thought, perhaps 300 yards, though in the darkness and confusion, he couldn't be certain. Between him and safety lay barbed wire, machine gun posts, and thousands of men trained to kill anything that moved. He began to crawl. Every inch was agony. The ground was a moonscape of craters, each one filled with freezing water or the decomposing remains of earlier battles. His uniform, already soaked through, clung to his skin like ice. Twice, he nearly crawled directly into German wire before spotting it in time. Once, he lay flat for an hour while a machine gun crew, not 30 feet away, smoked cigarettes and complained about the cold and words he couldn't understand but whose meaning was universal. By dawn, he'd covered perhaps 50 yards, and then he saw the trench. Not a British trench, a German one. Forward sap, probably pushed out beyond their main line. 2 soldiers stood in it, their backs to him. Rifles leaned against the sandbags. Arthur's throat tightened. He'd crawled in the wrong direction. He was behind enemy lines. The strategic situation along the Somme front in late 1916 was a nightmare of overlapping trenches and contested ground. For months of fighting had transformed the landscape into something that no longer resembled France or Earth, for that matter. The neat lines on staff officers' maps bore little relation to the reality on the ground, where old German positions mingled with new British advances, and pockets of no man's land existed deep inside what should have been secured territory. Men got lost. Whole platoons vanished into the fog and never returned. Arthur Pearce was about to become intimate with this chaos. As the sun rose, painting the sky a sickly yellow through the smoke of distant fires, he made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone thinking clearly. He couldn't go back, not in daylight, not across open ground. Forward was German trenches, certainly death or capture. So he chose a third option. He would go around. 200 miles around. The plan, if it could be called that, was born from desperation and the faint memory of a lecture given by a captain who'd studied maps. The Western Front wasn't a solid wall, it was a line, and lines had flanks. Somewhere to the north, the trenches ended at the coast. If he could reach the channel, if he could stay ahead of patrols, if he could avoid being shot as a spy or a deserter by either side, he might just possibly find a way back to British lines. This detail is confirmed in a wartime report from The Guardian, which later documented the extraordinary scope of Pearce's unauthorized journey through occupied France. He began walking that first night after darkness fell, staying low, moving through ruined farmland and shattered woods. His uniform marked him as British, which meant instant execution if caught by Germans, and probable arrest for desertion if found by any military police from his own side. He tore off his insignia, muddied his tunic, until the khaki was indistinguishable from civilian brown. He became a ghost. The first village he passed had been called Beaumont before the war. Now, it was rubble and rats. He crept through it after midnight, searching for food, and found instead a cellar where 3 French civilians, an old man, a woman, and a child were hiding from both armies. They stared at him with hollow eyes. The woman whispered something in French he couldn't understand, but she pushed a piece of hard bread into his hands anyway. He wanted to thank her, wanted to explain. Instead, he just nodded and disappeared back into the night, carrying the guilt of taking food from starving people. Days blurred together. He walked at night, hid during the day in barns and ditches, once in a church with half its roof blown away. He drank from puddles and streams, ate raw turnips stolen from frozen fields, and kept moving north. German supply columns passed within yards of his hiding spots. Once he lay buried in straw while soldiers searched the barn he was in, their voices casual, joking. He understood enough of their tone to know they were just going through the motions, not really expecting to find anyone. They didn't. The political reality of occupied France added layers to his danger. The region behind German lines was a patchwork of military administration and civilian suffering. Villages were commandeered, their populations pressed into labor or simply driven out. Collaboration was rare but real. Resistance was mostly silent but ever present. Arthur had no way to know who might turn him in for a reward or a measure of protection from the occupiers. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. By the end of the first week, he'd covered perhaps 40 miles. His feet were destroyed, boots falling apart, every step a fresh jolt of pain. He was starving, delirious with exhaustion, and completely lost. The coastal ports he'd been aiming for seemed like fantasy destinations in another world. He began to wonder if he should simply turn himself in to the Germans, take his chances as a prisoner of war, rather than die alone in a frozen ditch. Father Michel's church in the village of Frevin had become a way station for refugees and deserters from both sides, though Michel would have objected to that characterization. He helped people, he said simply, because God commanded it. When Arthur stumbled into his sanctuary on a January morning in 1917, more dead than alive, Michel didn't ask questions. Brought soup, real soup with potato, and something that might have once been chicken. He brought bandages for Arthur's feet. He brought news. The war hadn't ended. It had worsened. The Somme offensive was over, yes, but the slaughter continued everywhere else. Hundreds of thousands dead, and for what? A few miles of mud that would be fought over again come spring. Michel spoke with the weary authority of a man who'd buried too many young soldiers to believe in glory anymore. But he also brought hope. The British lines, he said, had shifted. A new offensive was being prepared to the north. If Arthur could reach the area around Arras, if he could approach carefully and signal his identity properly, he might make it back alive. It took another 6 weeks. The psychological toll of those weeks defied measurement. Arthur was no longer the young man who'd enlisted with romantic notions of defending civilization. He'd become something else, something harder, more suspicious, stripped of everything but the animal drive to survive. He trusted no one completely. He jumped at shadows. At night, when exhaustion finally dragged him under, he dreamed of the men from his patrol, their voices calling to him from the darkness, asking why he'd lived when they'd died. The frontline soldiers' experience of war, Arthur was learning, existed on a different plane from the political speeches or strategic maps. Down here in the mud, patriotism was an abstraction. What mattered was the next mile, the next meal, the next dawn. Survival wasn't heroic. It was mechanical, repetitive, brutal. Every decision was binary. Move or die, hide or die, steal food or die, he walked. The landscape changed as he moved north. The total devastation of the Somme gave way to contested areas where farming continued in the gaps between battles. He saw French peasants working fields while artillery thundered on the horizon, their faces expressions of numb acceptance. I saw German soldiers, too not, the caricatured monsters of propaganda posters, but tired young men who looked just as lost and frightened as he felt. In early March 1917, Arthur finally approached British lines near the village of Neuville-Vitasse. He'd been gone for 3 months and 9 days. His regiment had listed him as killed in action, His mother had received the telegram. A memorial service had been held. Private Arthur Pearce was officially dead. He waited until dark, then crept as close as he dared to the British trenches. The challenge was figuring out how to identify himself without getting shot. Men had been killed for less nervous sentries didn't ask questions first. So Arthur did the only thing he could think of, began to sing. It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. ... double quotes. His voice was cracked barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakably English, unmistakably British, unmistakably home. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. ... Movement in the trench, voices calling out challenges. Arthur kept singing, hands raised, walking slowly forward into the light of a flare that suddenly burst overhead, turning night to day. Goodbye, Piccadilly. Farewell, Leicester Square. ... double quotes. Someone shouted to hold fire. Sergeant's voice, thick with Lancashire accent, called out, "Who the bloody hell are you?" Arthur stopped walking, stopped singing. For a moment he couldn't speak at all. And Private Arthur Pearce, 16th Battalion, Manchester Regiment. I'm coming home. The military authorities didn't quite know what to make of him. Desertion charges were considered briefly, then dropped when his story was verified. He was debriefed extensively by intelligence officers who wanted details about German positions, troop movements, everything he'd seen. The strategic value of his accidental reconnaissance was considerable. He'd traveled through areas. British intelligence had only rough maps of observed supply routes and defensive preparations. Information that would cost other men's lives to obtain, Arthur had gathered simply by trying to survive. They gave him a week's leave, then sent him back to the trenches. The operational consequences of Arthur's journey were minor in the grand scheme of the war. His intelligence contributed marginally to planning for the Arras offensive that April. His story was quietly noted in regimental records but not publicized. The authorities worried that other trapped soldiers might attempt similar escapes and die in the process. Better to let men think capture or death were the only options than encourage desperate heroics. But the human consequences rippled outward in ways no staff officer could quantify. Arthur's mother, who'd been mourning a son she believed dead, got a letter in his handwriting. Men in the battalion heard the story and passed it along in whispers. Adding hope to the inventory of things they carried alongside ammunition and fear, Arthur himself lived, not just survived, but lived to see the war end, to return to Manchester, to marry and have children, and grow old. He never talked much about those 200 miles, when asked. He'd say only that he was lucky, and that luck was the difference between being a hero and being a casualty list. Footnote, but in the quiet moments, in the early mornings when his family still slept and he sat alone with tea and memories, he thought about Father Michel, about the Frenchwoman who gave him bread, about the 12 men who walked into that ambush on November the 23rd, 1916. And he wondered why he'd been the one who came home. Private Arthur Pearce died in 1963 at the age of 67, having outlived the war by 45 years. His obituary made no mention of the impossible journey. His medals, he'd been awarded no special decorations for his escape. Just the standard service awards were given to his grandson, who keeps them in a drawer and occasionally wonders about the old man he barely remembers. The fields of northern France have long since healed over the scars of 1916. Beaumont-Hamel is a memorial park now. The trenches are preserved in concrete, sanitized for tourists. Every November, poppies bloom red as memory. But somewhere in that earth, in the DNA of the land itself, there remains the ghost of a Patha, wandering desperate line traced by one terrified soldier who refused to stop walking, refused to stop breathing, refused to become just another name carved in stone. 200 miles through hell, one step at a time. That's how far a man will walk to come home.